He keeps a list of people he needs to apologize to before he dies. There is a piece of paper, sometimes literal, more often simply carried in his mind, that many older men maintain with a quiet, private discipline they show to almost nothing else in their lives. It's a list of names: a college roommate he wronged decades ago, a brother he stopped speaking to over something neither of them can fully remember anymore, a first wife he never properly apologized to before their marriage ended, a father who died before either of them found the words to repair what had broken between them. Some names on this list have already become permanently unreachable. Others remain, technically, still within reach, waiting for a phone call he keeps almost making. The wise observer has come to recognize this particular list as one of the more quietly urgent psychological phenomena of later life, a private ledger of unfinished emotional business that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore as a man's own mortality shifts from abstract concept to felt immediate reality. This isn't simple regret in the vague, generalized sense people sometimes experience about their past. It's something more specific and more actionable, a discrete accounting of particular relationships, of particular moments, particular words that were never spoken and now feel urgently, achingly overdue. To understand why this list forms so consistently across men of this generation, the wise observer must look at how differently accountability and reconciliation were modeled during their formative years compared to how they're discussed today. Many Gen X men grew up watching conflicts simply go unresolved rather than actively repaired grudges, maintained silently for years, relationships allowed to fade rather than confronted directly, apologies considered, at best, an occasional gesture reserved for truly catastrophic offenses rather than a normal part of maintaining healthy relationships. The result, for many of these men, is decades worth of smaller, unaddressed ruptures accumulating quietly in the background of an otherwise functional life. Consider what actually populates this list for most men who carry one. Rarely does it consist of single, dramatic betrayals requiring elaborate explanation. More often, it's a collection of smaller, almost mundane failures that nonetheless carry real emotional weight, a harsh word said to a sibling during a family argument 30 years ago that was never walked back, a friend abandoned during a difficult period because reaching out felt too uncomfortable at the time, a child disciplined too harshly during a stressful chapter of parenting that still produces a flinch of shame whenever he remembers it. These aren't the crimes of a genuinely bad man. They're the ordinary, accumulated debris of an imperfect life, made newly urgent by the growing awareness that time to address them is not, in fact, infinite. The wise observer wants to name something important here. The emergence of this list correlates strongly with specific mortality-confronting experiences rather than simply advancing age itself. A health scare, the death of a close friend his own age, watching a parent's decline, and eventual passing. These events function as what psychologists sometimes call mortality salience triggers, moments that force an abstract awareness of death into sudden, visceral clarity. It's precisely in the aftermath of these triggers that many men report the list crystallizing from vague background guilt into something concrete enough to actually write down, sometimes literally, on paper, kept in a drawer no one else knows about. There's a particular scene worth picturing that captures this pattern with real emotional weight. A man sits alone at his kitchen table late one evening, not long after attending the funeral of an old friend his own age, and finds himself, almost without deciding to, writing down names on the back of an envelope: his estranged brother, a former business partner he wronged financially decades ago, the mother of his first child, a relationship that ended badly and never received any real closure. He stares at the list for a long moment, the reality of his own mortality suddenly less abstract than it's ever felt before, and experiences a specific, urgent conviction that these names cannot simply remain unaddressed indefinitely, the way they've been allowed to remain unaddressed for the past several decades. This pattern often intensifies specifically around round-number birthdays and other symbolic markers of time passing, turning 60, turning 70, the anniversary of a parent's death at an age he's now approaching himself. These symbolic milestones seem to function as psychological deadlines, even though nothing about the actual passage of time changes meaningfully at these specific numerical thresholds. The wise observer suspects this reflects something deeply human about how people process mortality, needing concrete markers to translate an abstract, ongoing process into moments that feel like genuine turning points demanding action. It's worth examining what actually happens when men finally act on items from this list, because the outcomes vary considerably and deserve honest acknowledgement rather than uniform optimism. Some reconciliations proceed beautifully, decades of estrangement dissolving with surprising ease once someone finally makes the first move, both parties having quietly wished for exactly this outcome without either one willing to initiate it. Others prove considerably more complicated, the intervening years having calcified positions and resentments that a single apology, however sincere, cannot fully dissolve. And some attempts arrive too late in the most literal sense, the intended recipient having already passed away before the courage to reach out finally, tragically, materialized. The wise observer wants to be honest about this last category specifically, because it represents a genuine and common grief that deserves direct acknowledgement. Many men carry, alongside their list of people still living, a separate and often more painful category names of people who died before the apology or reconciliation could happen, representing a closure that will now never fully arrive in the way he'd hoped. This particular grief, the grief of permanently missed opportunity, often intensifies rather than resolves other items on the list, functioning as a stark warning about exactly what continued delay actually risks. There's a specific tenderness worth naming in how family members sometimes discover this list, usually by accident, and the profound shift in understanding it can produce. An adult child, helping an aging father organize his affairs, might discover a handwritten list of names tucked inside a desk drawer, immediately recognizing several people the family has quietly wondered about for years. This discovery often transforms how that child understands their father entirely, not as someone indifferent to old ruptures, but as someone who has carried the weight of them privately, sometimes for decades, waiting for courage that took considerably longer to arrive than anyone realized. It's worth acknowledging, too, how this list intersects with his broader difficulty around verbal apology, discussed extensively elsewhere. Even once he's decided to act, actually making the call, actually finding the words, remains genuinely difficult for men who've spent entire lifetimes avoiding exactly this kind of direct emotional exposure. Many describe rehearsing the conversation dozens of times before actually making the call, sometimes putting it off for months or years after finally deciding it needs to happen. The decision to act, and the actual execution of that decision, representing two entirely separate, equally difficult hurdles. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge the genuine relief many men describe once they finally address even a single item on this list, regardless of how the actual reconciliation unfolds. There's something psychologically significant about simply making the attempt, about no longer carrying the specific weight of complete inaction, even when the outcome itself remains imperfect or incomplete. A brother who doesn't fully forgive still receives an apology that was owed to him. A former colleague who remains distant still hears, directly, that his old business partner recognizes the harm that was done. The list, once acted upon, transforms from a source of anxious avoidance into evidence of genuine, if imperfect, moral effort. There's a particular irony worth naming in how selectively this list operates, revealing something important about which relationships actually carry the deepest unresolved weight. Many men can recite, without hesitation, small workplace disagreements or minor social slights they've long since released without difficulty. It's specifically the relationships involving genuine intimacy, family members, first loves, close childhood friends that tend to populate this more serious list, precisely because these relationships once carried enough significance that their rupture left a wound substantial enough to still be tender decades later. The list isn't a record of every mistake he's ever made. It's a record of every relationship that once mattered enough to genuinely hurt when it broke. It's worth examining how this pattern intersects with his relationship to his own aging parents specifically, an area that often carries particular urgency given the more immediate, visible timeline involved. Many men describe a specific, intensifying anxiety about repairing relationships with parents whose remaining time feels measurably shorter than his own, creating a kind of double mortality awareness, his own eventual death, combined with the more immediate, pressing reality of a parent's. This particular category of the list often gets addressed first, precisely because the deadline attached to it feels less abstract and more genuinely, uncomfortably concrete than deadlines attached to peer relationships. There's a specific scene worth picturing that illustrates how these reconciliation attempts sometimes unfold in practice, messier and more human than any tidy resolution might suggest. A man calls his estranged brother for the first time in 15 years, rehearsed apology ready, only to find the conversation veering unexpectedly into old, half-forgotten grievances neither of them had planned to revisit. The actual conversation looks nothing like what he'd imagined during months of anxious rehearsal, messier, more emotional, occasionally derailing into tangents that have nothing directly to do with the apology itself. And yet, despite this messiness, something genuine shifts between them by the end of the call, an imperfect but real beginning to a repair that will likely take considerably longer than a single conversation to fully complete. The wise observer wants to point out something specific about how this pattern shows up differently for men who experience their own parents dying with significant unfinished business still unresolved between them. These men often describe the most acute, urgent version of list-related anxiety, having witnessed firsthand exactly what permanent, unaddressed rupture actually costs, not just to the deceased parent, but to the surviving child left, holding an apology or reconciliation that will now never fully arrive. This direct experience of witnessing an unclosed account often becomes the single, strongest motivating force behind finally addressing his own list, functioning as a stark, personal cautionary tale rather than an abstract psychological concept. It's worth noting, too, how these reconciliation efforts sometimes benefit from involving a trusted third party, particularly when direct one-on-one contact feels too overwhelming to attempt alone. Some men describe writing a letter first, giving both parties time to process difficult emotions before any direct conversation occurs. Others enlist a sibling or mutual old friend to help facilitate an initial reconnection, reducing the immediate intensity of a first encounter after years of silence. These intermediary approaches represent practical wisdom about how genuinely difficult reconciliation is and how support structures can meaningfully improve the odds of success. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge how this list sometimes includes names of people he's wronged in ways too complicated or too painful to fully articulate even to himself. Relationships where his own role in the rupture involves genuine shame rather than simple estrangement. These particular items on the list often remain the most persistently avoided, precisely because addressing them requires not just courage, but genuine self-confrontation about specific behavior he's spent decades trying not to examine too closely. Progress on these especially difficult items often requires considerably more internal work before any actual outreach becomes possible, sometimes years of private reflection preceding the eventual attempt at repair. The specific urgency created by mortality awareness, uncomfortable as it is to sit with, often accomplishes something years of gentler encouragement never quite managed. It finally moves a man from private guilt into actual action. Families who notice a father approaching a significant birthday or processing a recent loss might find this precise moment uncomfortable, as it feels to raise directly represents genuine opportunity to gently encourage him toward the reconciliations he's likely already, privately, been considering himself. The wise observer's closing thought is this: if you love a man who's begun mentioning old names with unusual weight, who seems distracted by conversations about people from decades past, understand that he may be quietly working through a list only he can see, weighing courage against comfort in ways he's rarely had to before. The most valuable thing you can offer isn't pushing him toward action before he's ready, but simply making clear that whatever old business he's carrying would be welcomed, not judged, should he ever decide the time has finally come to set it down.